Alright, welcome to your week 14 lecture. This week we're going to be discussing domestic policy, and in particular we're going to focus on economic policy. This is week 14, so I just wanted to send you a quick reminder that your second essay, your major research paper, is due May 1st, and we have roughly 2 weeks to finish that paper. When you write your paper, once again, I recommend consulting the writing guide under the lessons tab. That way you guys can kind of see what I'm looking for, and there's some helpful hints and tips to maybe help you as you approach writing this essay. So if you haven't started your essay, I would definitely encourage you to do so now. And if you are, well, then good job. And if you need any help while you're writing your paper, feel free to contact me. You have my number, my email, my Skype address, and feel free to ask any number of questions that you may have. Alright, so let's go ahead and start on this week's lecture, domestic policy. Domestic policy is within the realm of public policy. And public policy is a big, wide, grand idea, and it covers both domestic and foreign. But domestic does fall under public policy, so we need to tackle what public policy is. Public policy, in the basic definition, is just a conflict over the ends of government. Basically, public policy is whatever the government chooses to do or not to do. So what kind of policies are implemented, what kind of policies are laid to the side. Debates over procedures and rules are really debates over policy. The results of public policy mirror conflicts and demand. This is because of varying consequences for different groups. We have different interest groups that have different policies that they want to see pushed forth. And so the results of public policy mirror those conflicts and demand. Those interest groups that accrue their interest and express those towards our politicians and towards our government officials, ultimately those demands are what gets put into public policy. So it mirrors the conflicts and demands. You may have groups such as the NRA that are pro-gun, and they want to see pro-gun public policies pushed through the government, whereas you have other groups such as, say, the Brady campaign, which are generally anti-gun, also have those demands and push those towards our politicians as well. So you have those conflicts and demands, and those ultimately result in public policy. Even policies designed to protect the common good may have certain consequences, and that's why public policy needs to be debated and hashed out in Congress or in government in general. The public policy process is really confusing at times. We're not really sure what bills are on the floor at all times. We're not sure what is being discussed in committee, and that's because public policy really is complicated. But in general, there are 5 stages in the evolution of policies that can kind of help make sense of this kind of chaotic process. So it breaks down within these 5 different stages. First, getting the issues on the agenda of government is the first major subset. The first 3 stages are in the orange here. The policy agenda is comprised of the list of issues that engage the attention of elected officials. So first off, you need to get the attention of elected officials. It needs to be important enough that politicians need to care about that and to put it onto their own political agenda. The issues on the policy agenda are always changing, though. Keep that in mind, that the public policy process is always changing. And third, keep in mind that there are different sets of issues that have dominated the policy agenda at different times. Formulating policy proposals, if it does have enough demand, if it is within the changing realm of the policy agenda, and if it is within a certain time frame or necessary time frame, then we can formulate the policy proposals. In this stage, debate centers around policy strategy, which is a course of action designed to deal with the real problem, with the original problem. What government should do, who should benefit, and who should bear the cost comprise the material of the policy debate. Public policy is always debated, and there's always those 3 factors. What should the government do about it? Who should benefit from this public policy, or who will benefit from this public policy? And then who should bear the cost? All public policy usually derives some sort of cost, particularly within enforcement and within a bureaucratic agency and things like that. So that's all part of the public policy debate, is what should the government do, who should benefit, and how are we going to take care of this monetarily and with enforcing the law as well. So there are 2 basic policy categories. We have domestic policy and foreign policy. Today we're going to talk about domestic policy, and there are a lot of things that we could actually discuss under domestic policy because domestic policy is such a big concept. Because there are so many, because the policy agenda is always changing, like I said, because there are so many things that we could discuss, domestic policy it contains so many things. But we're going to focus specifically on economic policy, and I'll go ahead and justify that here in just a little bit. Opposite of domestic policy is foreign policy, anything outside the United States. How does the United States handle certain things? And that's what we're going to talk about next week. Next week we're going to talk about foreign policy. And that's where I believe that's going to be our last lecture of the semester, so that's where we're going to end with foreign policy. All right. The presence or absence of economic self-interest is another useful criterion for differentiating policies. Everybody has economic interest. Everybody has, they want to be better off. They want to make the best life that they can for themselves, and that's why certain policies will be debated at certain times, and other policies will not. That's why certain people will push for certain policies to go through government, and other policies are just laid to the wayside. All right, categories of national government policies. Foreign and defense policies are among the oldest functions. As a nation, we've always had to deal with foreign adversaries. You can think back, even before we were a nation, we were dealing with foreign policy, and the fact that we were dealing with Great Britain across the seas and as their colonies. We had to, it was kind of a way of foreign policy where the colonies were having to deal with their colonizers, Great Britain. So foreign and defense policies are among our oldest types of functions and policy debates within our national government. But more recently, the most significant policy growth over the past half century has occurred in the category of social welfare, taxing and spending, and other economic interest. So that's why we're going to go ahead and talk about economic policy today. I believe that economic policy is very important for you to learn. The reason why is because you're always going to have to be dealing with economics. You're always going to have money to spend. You're always going to have to deal with buying imported versus domestic goods. You're going to have to deal with your tax rate if you file your taxes each year. And you're also going to have to deal with banks and loans and how to take out money and what the interest rate on your car loan or on your house payment is. So that's why I feel like it's so important today to discuss economic policy under the realm of domestic policy. Domestic policy, like I said, handles a number of things from abortion laws to marijuana legalization to highways and transportation, and then also economics. So that's why I feel like while we could discuss a number of topics under domestic policy, I feel like economic policy is the best one to be aware of because it affects so many things. So that being said, let's go ahead and deal with the three subcategories of economic policy. So you have domestic policy, then you have economic policy, and then under economic policy you have three different subsets. First you have trade policy, second you have monetary policy, and then third you have fiscal policy. First one we're going to tackle is trade policy. Trade policy, just by definition, the definition that you will probably see on your test is trade policy is when the government regulates the economy by raising or lowering tariffs and encouraging or discouraging trade with other nations. So we're going to tackle each of those things today. We're going to tackle tariffs, we're going to talk about trade with other nations as well. Monetary policy, the second one that we're going to talk about today, monetary policy is where the government regulates the economy by manipulating interest rates, particularly on banks and the loans that they give the consumers. And then finally, we're going to end on fiscal policy, where the government regulates the economy through its powers to tax and spend. We all have to pay taxes at some time in our life, but that being said, the taxes that the government raises is usually spent on public programs that benefits the public at large. So that's why fiscal policy is very, very good to be aware of. So let's go ahead and deal with trade policy first. We're increasingly dealing with a global economy, and this is why trade policy has become so important in recent times. We're dealing with a global economy. You can see this nice picture here of money floating around the world, and that's kind of how it is, even though this is kind of a fictional image in a way. Trade policy, we usually measure trade policy by our balance of trade. Balance of trade, by definition, just measures the difference between the monetary value of imports and exports. You have a trade surplus and then a trade deficit. A trade surplus means that we are exporting more than we are importing, meaning we're making more profit from exporting our own goods than we are from accruing debts and making payments from importing our own goods. Trade deficit means that we are importing way more than we are exporting. So we're losing money because we're buying more goods from foreign nations than we are making money off of selling our own goods in foreign nations or selling our own goods elsewhere. So trade surplus means that we're making more money We're exporting more than we are importing. Trade deficit means that we are importing more than we're exporting. I hope that makes sense. If you're taking notes, I hopefully just write that quote down. That should make sense. Also, feel free to rewind in the YouTube video if you need to hear me say that again. But it does make sense. Here in the U.S., though, because of the way of our economy is going, we're actually importing way more than we're exporting. So we have a trade deficit. And you can see this graph down here at the bottom. And we've had a trade deficit for almost 30 plus years, or more than 30 plus years. It started around 1980. That's when our manufacturing sector started going downhill, and we started importing more than we were exporting. We just couldn't keep up with the foreign competition. So we just started importing, and then we kind of changed our economy into this service sector type of economy that we have now. But you can see here in the 1980s, it didn't start off too bad. We were certainly importing more than we were exporting, but it still wasn't too bad. But around the year 1995 or so, we started importing more than we were exporting, and part of that has to do with the rise of the internet. We were starting to buy goods from elsewhere off the internet and bringing them into the United States. The world became more connected with the internet. But it really continued, and you can see this downward trend all the way through 2006. We finally started, we really started running our trade deficit up, and around $750 billion more. We had a trade deficit of around $750 billion more. Forgive me there. Trade deficit of about $750 billion. Man, I keep messing that up. Sorry. But that was our highest trade deficit. You can see it's gotten a little bit better, particularly after the economic collapse. We started making our own goods after the economic collapse because we had to. We had to build. The world economy was suffering. We had to build our own stuff. We had to start manufacturing our own stuff. But it's also declined since then as well. So we still have this massive trade deficit, and you can see that this trend will probably continue for a long time. The fact is that the United States just doesn't manufacture as much as it used to. We don't build our own goods. We don't manufacture our own goods, and it's much easier to import them from elsewhere where the cost is way low. And that's another debate that we're going to get on here in just a little bit with the free trade. But these are the U.S. numbers for 2013. 2013, our biggest imports were consumer products. Obviously, anything that's manufactured, anything that you usually buy at Walmart, things like that, Target, those are all imported because those are consumer-type products. We just don't manufacture those here in the United States. So we imported about $533 billion of consumer products. Petroleum-related products was a huge import sector as well. We import most of our fuels from elsewhere. Automotive, we've begun to manufacture less of our own cars and vehicles, and instead we're importing them. You can think of a number of car manufacturers such as BMW or Toyota or Honda. Those are all imported, even though Toyota is starting to build their own manufacturing plants here. But we still import a number of automotive products. And then other services, $453.3 billion. We also import a number of service sector type economies. You can think of phone banks and things like that. Exports. America does still make a fair amount of stuff, though. Obviously not more than we are exporting, or we're importing way more than we're exporting, but we still do export consumer products around $188.5 billion in the year 2013. We also export a number of automotives, and then also our service sectors. We export $682 billion worth of services, and we only import $450.3 billion of services. So you can see that we are much more of a service sector type economy because we export more services than we do import. But besides the service sector economy, you can see that we definitely import more than we export, and that's why we have a trade deficit. All right. The trade debate. This is going to be one of your discussion board questions, so be sure to kind of weigh in on this just a little bit. The trade debate. There's an idea of protectionism versus free trade. Protectionism says that we shouldn't engage in free trade, that we shouldn't engage in a globalized economy. Instead, what we should do is protect our domestic producers. We're not, the people that that subscribe to protectionism say that domestic producers need to be protected from foreign imports. We need to quit importing from foreign nations and look to build our own economy. We need to look to build manufacturing plants. We need to look to keep most of our products here at home, protect domestic producers and workers from foreign competition. And one way to do this is to raise tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So that's why when you buy a BMW that's imported from Germany, there's a tax on that. There's a tariff. It's way more expensive to buy a BMW than it is to, say, buy a Chevy. Because a Chevy is manufactured here in the United States. And it's because it's not imported, because it's made within the United States, there's no extra tax. There's no extra tariff on that. There is that tariff on that BMW from Germany. And that's why that BMW costs more, because there's a tariff added to that. And it's the same thing with a lot of products. You can think of most of the things that you buy from Walmart. If they're imported from China, they may be a little bit more expensive than if it was made here in the U.S. Except for maybe you can think of a number of examples such as clothes. Clothes that are imported from elsewhere are cheaper because of the labor cost with associated with that. That's why imported clothes are cheaper than clothes that are made here in the U.S. But it still does have a certain tariff on that. But the tariff is not enough to make it more than the USA made product. So tariffs are used, they say, raise these tariffs to protect these domestic producers and workers. And that would be the idea of protectionism. If we were to raise tariffs, we would see a level of protectionism. The domestic made products, the USA made products, would be cheaper than the would be cheaper than the foreign made products. But you don't want to raise tariffs too much because that discourages global trade, and that's where free trade comes in. It says that trade barriers, such as tariffs, should be dismantled. The flow of goods, capital, and labor should be unrestricted as possible. The free trade is really a kind of a free market idea. Let consumers buy the cheapest products no matter where they may be from, and eliminate the tariffs so that we have a free flow of goods. That's the idea of free trade. Some people say that protectionism is better because we need to protect domestic producers and workers and it boosts our local economy. But the free trade also says, well, it's good for consumers because they can get cheaper products if we eliminate the tariffs, and therefore they'll spend more money and that'll boost the economy as well. So both sides do have some merit. Both sides also have some cons as well. This is where we look at free trade as a good thing, and then on the next slide we're going to look at free trade as a bad thing. So this would be the pros to free trade, if you will. First off, you have a benefit to producers. You can exercise your comparative advantage, meaning that one state is probably better at producing one type of product than another state, and then that other state is probably better at producing a good better than the other state, or better at producing a good rather than the first state. So each state will particularly specialize. If we allow free trade, each state will specialize in what they're good in, and then they'll be able to exchange those goods for better products. So you can exercise your comparative advantage. You can exercise your comparative advantage. You can hone in on what you're good at, and then exchange the goods with other countries that are good at producing something else that maybe you're not. So if you have a question about comparative advantage, it's a kind of a tricky economic concept, but it does kind of make sense. I hope I kind of made sense when I explained it. If I didn't, feel free to send me those questions though. And another benefit to producers is that you increase the size of the market. If you have free trade, you're not only able to sell your products domestically, but you're also able to increase the size of your market and sell your products around the world. That's great, isn't it? If you can increase your size of the market, you produce more sales, then you can exercise your right to produce more goods to meet the market demand from around the world. Some proponents of free trade also say that there's a benefit to consumers. You can obtain a greater variety of goods and services, and they're usually cheaper because it's easier. Like I said, it's easier to import clothes from, say, Taiwan or Thailand or China, because labor is so cheap there that the cost associated with making that good is so low that therefore the cost cutting is passed on to the consumer, and they can obtain the greater variety of goods from around the world, and they can usually focus on getting them cheaper. Then the benefit to the world, finally, third, is that free trade equals world peace. Studies show that there is a correlation between free market, enterprise, and exchange of goods and peace, because you don't want to start a war with a country that is producing a good that you need. And that's why there's a correlation between free trade and peace. And it's called the capitalist peace. It's very well studied within political science, and it's something that I study myself. And so it's very interesting that there is a correlation between free trade, free globalization, and world peace. But there is kind of a cult of free trade where there may be concern that we're having too much free trade. So that's where we get into free trade equals bad. Well, just as there's a benefit to the producers, there's also a cost to some of the producers. The fact is that with a free trade market, with a market with no barriers or no trade barriers or no certain laws, if you have complete free trade, that there will be cheaters. Not everyone is a free trader. There will be certain cheaters that cheat the market to kind of screw over the other guy, if you will. Excuse my language if that was offensive, but to kind of screw over the other guy, if you will. There will be cheaters that will try to undersell and take advantage of the free market. Second of all, the cost of producers, particularly here for the U.S., is that we can't compete with foreign labor. Here in the United States, there's a minimum wage that we need to pay workers, and so we can't compete with the cheap foreign labor that works in, say, sweatshops or maquiladoras or things like that. We simply just can't compete with foreign labor. So if we allow too much free trade, then the U.S. market will suffer more or less because they have to pay those labor costs. And then finally, whole sectors of the economy have disappeared because of free trade, and it's partly because of this foreign labor kind of idea. You can think of the Detroit auto industry. That's kind of in shambles, more or less, and it's because it's cheaper to produce a car with cheaper labor, and then pass those cost-cutting measures and those kind of sales, if you will, onto the consumer. You can think of the auto industry has really suffered because of cheap foreign labor. Textiles have really suffered because of cheap foreign labor. Call centers, accounting, computer hardware, all of those sectors kind of have been lost here in the United States because it's cheaper to hire labor elsewhere to do it and then pass those benefits on to consumers. And then second, there is a cost to consumers, actually. Even though we like all these foreign goods, we like Walmart, we like buying the cheap goods from Walmart, it's great, we can get TVs for cheap, we can get our daily needs real cheap, but because we're losing so many jobs, they can't really afford to pay for those cheap goods. They may be cheaper, but if there are no jobs, if we're losing jobs to foreign labor, then how are consumers supposed to be able to pay for those goods if they don't have the jobs to begin with? So complete free trade could equal bad if it is carried out to a large extent. That's why you need kind of this delicate balance between free trade and protectionism. You need to make sure that workers have jobs in your own economy, but you also want cheap products for those consumers as well, and those average Americans as well. So free trade and protectionism is a really delicate balance. Part of your discussion question will be to hone in on this free trade debate. I want you to Google it a little bit and research it just a little bit and kind of give me your opinion on free trade versus protectionism. All right, so that's the trade policy. Let's go ahead and deal with monetary policy now. Monetary policy is different from trade policy. It's also different from fiscal policy. Monetary policy basically deals with money and how the government controls the money supply. One of the most common concepts that we're familiar with is inflation. And it is simply, inflation just measures the rate at which prices increase. You can probably talk to your grandparents or your parents, and they can probably tell you how they bought a Coke or a gallon of gas way back in the day for really cheap. Cokes used to be 5 cents, then 25 cents, and now it's $1.50 at a vending machine usually. Same with gallon of gas. Gallon of gas used to be 16 cents. Now it's over $2 and sometimes even over $3 at particular times. The fact is that inflation just happens. Things get more expensive as it goes through because people need to make more profit to live, basically. There are too many dollars chasing too few goods is basically the idea of inflation. Inflation also looks at the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which is basically just a market basket of goods. Consumer Price Index basically says how much did this market basket of goods, this kind of fictitious, imaginary market baskets of goods, you can maybe think of bread, eggs, milk, those sorts of things, and how much did that cost back in 1970 versus how much does it cost now today? That's what the Consumer Price Index measures. It measures inflation and measures how much a normal market basket of goods cost compared to how it used to cost. On the opposite of inflation, there is deflation. Deflation happens very, very rarely, but there are some speculators that say we're going through an era of deflation right now. Things may be getting cheaper. You can think of houses are getting cheaper, cars are getting cheaper as well. There may be an era of deflation, although those periods are often very, very short. But I just wanted to throw that idea out there for now. Causes of inflation include the Federal Reserve Bank increasing the money supply, which we're going to talk about, market power, how well the market is doing. If the market's doing poor, inflation is going to go up. If the market's doing well, we might have an era of deflation. Demand pull. If there's a lot of demand for a product, but not a whole lot of products themselves, then they're going to raise the cost because they realize that people really want this product, and there will probably be a few people that will actually spend a ridiculous amount of money just to get that particular product. You can think around Christmas how there's usually one kind of popular Christmas toy that consumers really, really want, but the manufacturer only made a certain amount of that particular Christmas toy. That's demand pull. That means that there's a lot of demand for that particular Christmas toy, but some crazy parents will pay a lot of money to satisfy their kid and to make sure that that kid has that particular product for Christmas. And so that's demand pull. That would also increase the price of a particular good. And then supply shock. Let's say that something happened to the amount of bananas in the world. Sorry, that's probably a poor example, but say that a huge plague came over the banana crops and there's only a few amount of bananas left. And so if there's a supply shock like that where there's only a little bit of one product left in the world, that will also increase the price because there's so many of that product left, and so they have to raise the price just to kind of still be in the black, to make ends meet. They'll raise the price because there's so few of that product. That's the idea of supply shock. So there's a number of ways that inflation can increase. And it all kind of deals with monetary policy. Monetary policy is the actions that the Federal Reserve itself undertakes to influence the amount of money in the U.S. economy. And they'll influence the amount of money in the U.S. economy to adjust to inflation or to stymie inflation a little bit. Three major points here. Changes to the amount of money affect interest rates. Loans to banks, home loans, business loans. All of the amount of money that's out there in the economic system affects the interest rates that you will pay at the bank. The Federal Reserve can stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply. If the economy is poor, the Federal Reserve can stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply, meaning the Federal Reserve just basically puts more money out there in the system. If you remember back to 2008 or 2009, you guys may have been too young, but your parents probably received a stimulus check from the Federal Reserve because we needed to kind of stimulate the economy. We needed more money to be out there in the economy to kind of to let it go, to kind of get some traction under its wheels so the economy can start going. And that's the Federal Reserve. It can stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply. But it's a delicate balance because, once again, if there's too much money out there, well, then you see major inflation. So it's a delicate balance. You want you want a lot of money out there so that consumers are spending, but you don't want too much money because that increases inflation. The Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve? Let's go ahead and tackle that right now. The Federal Reserve is just the central bank that oversees our money policy. And I realize I just spelled overseas wrong there, so please forgive me. The central bank that oversees, S-E-E-S, our monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is the banker's bank. All banks are responsible to the Federal Reserve. Because the Federal Reserve sets their interest rates and sets monetary policy, all banks must coordinate with the Federal Reserve in order to set those interest rates correctly, and if banks are in trouble, they can get more money they can get their own loans from the federal bank or from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is also the government's bank. Most of the government's money is supplied by the Federal Reserve. And in general, the Federal Reserve is the nation's money manager. They're the ones that say you get your allowance this week or you don't get your allowance this week, basically. They're the nation's money manager. They're also the ones uniquely that are responsible for printing more money if needed be. There's limited government oversight over the Federal Reserve. The federal government more or less just kind of trusts the Federal Reserve to do what is necessary to keep the economy afloat or to keep the banks afloat. So there's actually limited government oversight. The expression is often the Federal Reserve is as federal as Federal Express. FedEx, the shipping company, is not actually a federal enterprise, even though it says Federal Express. It's a private company that does shipping. Because there's so limited government oversight, there's kind of this concern, particularly among more libertarian and conservative-minded individuals, that the Federal Reserve is doing some backdoor kind of dealings, and that because it's not really been audited in a long time, that it should be audited. We should make sure that the Federal Reserve is actually doing the correct thing, and that we should add more government oversight and audit the Fed. But that kind of depends on your own political ideology and what you believe there. But it is definitely a strain of debate, and a definitely worthy strain of debate, whether we should audit the Fed or not. But I just wanted to introduce you to the idea of the Federal Reserve and how it influences the money supply overall. Federal Reserve and most banks deal with something called fractional reserve banking, and this is all under monetary policy. Banks, they make money by loaning money. The fact is that they make money off the car loans, off the home loans, off the business loans that they loan out to people because they charge that particular interest rate. That's how they make their money. They make their money off of that interest rate that you took out on that loan. All banks have reserve ratios, which means cash in the vault. All banks are required to keep a particular amount of cash in the vault, the reserve ratio. And if they have this particular cash in the vault, this prevents a run on deposits, or what used to be called a run on the bank. What happened in the Great Depression was that you had this run on the bank, this run on deposits, where people would give their money to the bank, and then the bank would take that money that they gave them that they put in their savings account, their checking account, and things like that. The bank would take that money from regular people, and then the bank would give out loans to businesses, to car owners, to homeowners, and then that money was no longer there. Well, if that money's no longer there, let's say someone comes in one day and says, I would like to take out my money, and then that money's not there, then the bank has to shut down. The consumer or the regular person who holds that bank account won't get their money either. And that's what led to the economic collapse of the 1930s, is that these banks didn't keep cash in the vault. They didn't keep this reserve ratio. And so when the economy collapsed and people wanted to go to the bank to take out their savings to try to pay for things, the money wasn't there, and the bank had to close, and the consumer never got their money back. So that's why, since the 1930s, after the Great Depression, all banks are required to keep a reserve ratio, or a cash in the vault. And it gets kind of scary sometimes if the bank approaches that reserve ratio. If the bank approaches that reserve ratio, then they have to go ahead and take loans from elsewhere. They can borrow from other banks, or they can borrow from the Federal Reserve. Borrowing from other banks requires a federal funds rate. It's a market-driven interest rate that banks charge one another for loans. So one bank will go to another bank, say, hey, we're approaching our reserve ratio, we need to increase it a little bit so that we don't have a run on the banks. And they'll go to the other bank, they'll say that, and then the bank will charge them a particular rate, which is called the federal funds rate. Rates will drop when there is excess loan money in the financial system, meaning that the economy will speed up. That bank, because there's so much money out there for the banks to have, more or less, then they'll be able to charge the other bank a lower interest rate. There's excess loan money out there in the financial system, and the economy will speed up because that bank has enough money, and then they loan the other bank the other money, and that bank also now has enough money. So the economy is covered. The economy is fine. The economy will speed up. Rates will rise, though, when the available loan money is restricted. Let's say there's not a lot of money floating out there in the economic system at all. Then that bank will have to make sure to get its profit back by charging the other bank a higher interest rate. So when their economy is slow, or when there's not a lot of money floating around, banks don't want to borrow from other banks, because the fact is that they're going to get charged a high interest rate. When the economy is slow, they want to go ahead and borrow from the Fed at what is called a discount rate. A discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges the banks for loan. And the Fed is willing to make this discount rate because the Fed wants to see the economy speed up. We'll charge them a low interest rate so that they're able to actually pay back the money. And because they got charged a low interest rate, the banks will be able to pass on those savings to their own bankers, or to their own account holders that are looking to take out a loan, and the consumers will get to pay a low interest rate, as will the bank when they try to repay the Fed. If the Federal Reserve lowers the discount rate, then banks can borrow money from the Fed and offer cheaper loans to people and businesses. So that's basically what I'm trying to say, is that when the economy is slow, the banks will look to the Fed to take out loans, and then to pass on those loan savings onto their consumers. And they can offer those cheaper loans to people and businesses. This stimulates the economy. This is how the Fed stimulates the economy. The Fed looks to stimulate the economy when the economy is slow. But there is one word of caution. The fact is that if these banks are looking to stimulate the economy by taking out loans from the Fed, well, if they take the loans from the Fed, then there's going to be more money floating in the system. So that's why there's that but there. The Federal Reserve manipulates the money supply by controlling the interest rates. When banks have more money to loan, the economy can speed up. But too much money causes inflation and malinvestment. So that's why it's such a delicate balance. Yeah, you would like cheap interest rates, and yeah, you would like to have the banks to have more money to loan to you. But if there's so much money floating out there in the economic system, then that causes inflation. So it's this delicate balance of, yeah, we want the economy to speed up, but we don't want it to speed up too rapidly. So we must be cautious, and we must be cautious that the banks don't loan too much money out there. So that's why it's kind of a paradox. Yeah, you would like people to be taking out loans, and you would like people to be able to afford to buy cars and houses and things like that. But if too many people malinvest their money or have too much money and just hold on to it, then that increases inflation for the entire system. So that's why we need to talk about the status of the dollar. Because inflation was so high after 2008, and because the Fed tried to stimulate the money, where are we at now today? The dollar is still considered to be the world's reserve currency. All countries keep a reserve of the U.S. dollar. They have a certain reserve of the U.S. dollar because it's the U.S. dollar that is traded on the global market. Everything is priced in relation to the U.S. dollar because the U.S. dollar was strong for so long. However, between 2002 and 2009, the dollar lost about 1/3 of its value compared to other currencies. It is speeding up just a little bit. The U.S. economy has recovered just a little bit, but it's still not as where it used to be, say, in the 1970s or even before then. Remember, the status of the dollar does not necessarily mean the value of dollar, and the reason why I say that is because the dollar is compared to gold. Gold has outstripped the value of the dollar, but the dollar still remains the U.S. Reserve's currency, even though it may have lost particular value between 2000 and 2009. That's why I wanted to show you this little graph. It may not show up very well on your screen, and I apologize for that. It doesn't show up very well on my screen, so I can only imagine how bad it shows up on your screen. But if you can see here, the green is the value of the dollar, and then the gold is obviously the value of gold. And what you see here is that in 2001, the dollar was at an all-time high. The dollar was very, very valuable. People wanted to buy the U.S. dollar. They wanted to, if on the monetary exchanges and things like that, they wanted to have the U.S. dollar because it was so valuable. But then 2001 happened, and we started getting into a number of wars and other things, and the value of the dollar really, really dropped. The U.S. economy hit rock bottom, and that didn't help either. Or it didn't hit rock bottom, but we had the Great Recession, which we've all lived through now, if you're in my course. And we all had that, and that was very, very problematic. And what happened was that gold went up, and the dollar went down. So the value of the U.S. dollar has really dropped. The dollar isn't worth what it used to be, and therefore the purchasing power and inflation and all those sorts of things have gone up. So that's why it's very important to know the value of the dollar, because the value of the dollar affects how much you can purchase and the rate of inflation as well. So I just wanted to give you a general idea of those sorts of things. All right, and finally with monetary policy, we need to talk about the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product has a lot to do with inflation. It basically tells us how the economy is doing. If the economy is doing well, we're going to have a high gross domestic product. If the economy is doing bad, we're going to have a very low gross domestic product. The gross domestic product, or the GDP, and I can guarantee this question at least the definition or the question will be on your test. The GDP measures the value of all goods and services produced in a nation. Produced in a nation. So, like I said, if the economy is doing very well, the nation will be producing a lot of things, and people will have jobs, and inflation will be down, and things like that. So that's why the GDP kind of measures how the economy is doing. It measures the value of all goods and services produced in a nation, and if it's very high, the economy is doing well. If it's going low, then the economy is not doing well. So we want a high GDP. We want the economy to be doing well. We want people to be spending money. We want them to be spending money on goods and services, and that way we can count it towards our GDP. However, there may be sort of this GDP growth illusion, if you will. I'll call it an illusion, because we need to account for how GDP is measured. Remember, it's the measure of all the values and goods and services produced in a nation, but it's kind of odd because if we borrow money and we spend it on programs, we count it towards our GDP. If we build a missile and then we shoot it, that also is counted towards our GDP. Building a missile and shooting it benefits no one, but we count it because, hey, we produced it and we shot it off and we used it. Even though it didn't benefit anyone, it didn't help the economy in any way, it only helped the economy in the fact that maybe we paid some workers to build it. Say housing projects. We build these houses and we count it towards our GDP, but they sit empty. It's not really helping anything. We counted it towards our GDP because we built it and it's valuable. But if no one is using it, no one's, say, taking out a loan to buy that house or anything, it's not really helping the economy overall. So that's why GDP is a good measure of how the economy is doing, but it also needs to be taken with a grain of salt as to how the economy is actually doing. Because the GDP may be high, but it may be an illusion because it may not actually be that high, and it may not be a true signal of how well the economy is doing. But it is probably the best measure that we have of how the economy is doing. So I just wanted to mention that real quick, and I can guarantee that the definition of GDP will be on the test. So monetary policy covered a lot of things, and I understand that may be confusing. You're not used to thinking in an economic mindset. You may have questions about inflation or the Federal Reserve or loans and interest rates and things like that. So once again, if you have any questions about monetary policy, send those my way as well, and I'll be happy to answer them. But let's go ahead and deal with our final topic today, which is fiscal policy. And I like this little cartoon here where you have the masses and they're angry and they say, go ahead, raise our taxes. The truth is you're never going to have an angry mob begging you to raise their taxes. Taxes are a very tricky thing and they're a highly debated topic. So that's why I feel it's very important to know the facts behind taxes and fiscal policy. So let's go ahead and tackle that right now. Fiscal policy. If you remember way back to week 1 where I gave you the definition of politics, this is kind of where it comes back to life here. The definition of politics that I gave you was by Harold Laswell that said who gets what, when, and how. Well, the game of politics is all about deciding who gets what, and part of that involves deciding who pays for what. Taxes are a way to ensure that the government can pay for certain social programs or certain things that benefit the public at large. So that's why we go back to Harold Laswell, where who gets what, when, and how. How they usually get it is through taxes, and when is when the government collects the taxes from it. So we're back to Harold Laswell. Who gets what, when, and how. The game of politics is all about deciding who gets what, and part of that involves deciding who pays for what. Fiscal policy deals with all taxation and expenditures. Taxation is getting money or raising money for the government, and then expenditures is the government spending money on a number of programs and things like that. So, major actors in fiscal policy is the President, Congress, and the Congressional Budget Office. These are the 3 major actors. President is very active in fiscal policy. He submits proposals for the annual budget. He's the one that influences Congress with the State of the Union and things like that to try to get certain programs pushed, certain tax programs, certain expenditure programs as well. The President has the veto power to influence what is being spent and what isn't being spent, or what we should be spending things on and what we shouldn't be spending on. If the President disagrees that we should be spending money on this program, then he'll go ahead and veto that program. If he believes that we should be spending money on this particular program, then he'll go ahead and put his signature on the bill as soon as it's passed through Congress. The President also has the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. The Office of Management and Budget is the wing of the executive branch, or the department, if you will, of the executive branch that deals with the annual budget proposals and deals with how the economy is doing and what we should be spending money on, what we shouldn't be spending money on. So the Office of Management and Budget is strictly for the President, strictly for the executive branch. That's how it's different than the Congressional Budget Office, and I'll go ahead and explain that here in just a little bit. But second of all, Congress is very active in fiscal policy. They're the ones that set the budget. You have House and Senate committees that determine how revenue is raised and spent. You have a lot of committees within Congress that determine fiscal policy. They're the ones that will determine new tax rates if tax rates need to be adjusted. They're the ones that will determine what we should be spending our money on, what we shouldn't be spending our money on. And with Congress comes the Congressional Budget Office. Remember, the OMB up here is for the President. They're the ones that will submit the proposal, organize the budget, and things like that. But the Congressional Budget Office is much more of a research type institute. They're the ones that will study the budgetary effects of certain spending proposals. Say a spending proposal came before Congress to vote on. The Congressional Budget Office would do a lot more in-depth research and try to make predictions about how that spending proposal that is before Congress right now will affect the economy overall. The Congressional Budget Office is believed to be non-biased, but the fact is that, say, Republicans control Congress or the Democrats control Congress, the Congressional Budget Office will have a certain amount of bias to it based on who is in the majority and therefore who controls the Congressional Budget Office. But overall, it's pretty much non-biased because different proposals come from a number of sources, if you will. So those are the major actors involved in fiscal policy. What about fiscal policy? Where are we at with fiscal policy here in the United States? Well, the most recent numbers that I could find from 2013, these are the overall numbers for 2013. We generated $2.77 trillion in revenue, and that's through taxes and a number of other avenues. We generated that much in revenue. However, we spent, total expenditures are $3.45 trillion. So the deficit is around $680 billion for the year 2013. I wish I could have the 2014 numbers for you. Hopefully they'll have those published by the next time I give these lectures. But the fact is that we are running a deficit. Just as we're running a trade deficit, we're also running a deficit in our budget. And the budget deficit is simply the amount by which, in a given year, the government spending exceeds the government revenue. So if spending exceeds revenue, you're going to have a budget deficit. And as you saw on that last slide, we did spend more than we raised. Budget surpluses, they're very, very rare, but that's when revenue outstrips expenditures. That means we raised more money from taxes than what we spent in that year. All of these deficits lead to the national debt. It's the nation's cumulative deficit. So the deficit from one year is added to the deficit from this year, and that's how we get our total for the national debt. And so it's very interesting because our deficits have actually gone down from year to year for the past, say, 8 years or so. The deficits have actually gone down, but because we're still running deficits, it's still adding to our national debt. So our national debt is way up, even if we are decreasing deficits. So the government is trying to decrease its deficit, but because we're not there yet, because we don't have a budget surplus yet, we're still adding to our national debt. And I've added the link here for the national debt clock. If you want to go ahead and click on that, it's actually very interesting, and you can see exactly where our nation's debt is right now. As of the end of 2013, most recent figures I could find, we have about a $16.7 trillion in debts, and that's all the deficits that we've added for a number of years. Last time we had a budget surplus was way there in the late 90s because we had the internet boom and things like that. But since then we've had deficits each year, and that's how we've added to our national debt to the tune of $16.7 trillion right now. And then also adding to our national debt is that we do have a number of interest payments. We've taken loans from other countries, and we have to pay off those interest rates to other countries and things like that. So that's also adding to our national debt each year as well. All right, so that's the national debt. We need to talk about, are there viable solutions? How can we decrease the deficit and then therefore start decreasing our national debt? Well, both on the left and the right side, there's a number of viable solutions that have come up, or possible solutions. I wouldn't necessarily say they're viable because they haven't been tested, but they are possible solutions. One thing that you often hear about is, should we cut the welfare system? Should we cut the amount of entitlements and things like that people will receive? That's one viable solution. However, as you'll see in the national budget, it's actually not enough to decrease the deficit overall, or to eliminate the deficit overall, but it would be a good start if we did do that. But then you have low public spending, and you have poor people getting poorer and things like that. So both on the left and the right side, there's a number of debates for cutting the welfare state. One thing we could do is just simply increase our revenue. Increase our revenue by raising taxes. Raise the taxes on, say, the top 20 or the top 1%, and therefore, because we can tax the top 1% or top 20%, therefore we can add to our revenue taxes that are raised, money that is raised, and try to cut the deficit that way. But then you have people that would argue, well, if we raise the taxes on the top 20%, top 1%, then they're not going to be willing to stay in the United States. They'll move their businesses elsewhere, things like that. Or they'll try to cheat the tax code and things like that. So there's, once again, both arguments on the left and the right side for increasing the revenue. Going along with increased revenue, I guess I didn't see that third point there, but I already mentioned it, tax the rich more. No more career politicians. That's also a very interesting solution that has been brought up a number of times. If you eliminate career politicians, you can eliminate the amount of money that they receive, or the money, the earmarks and the things like that that are added to bills. You can decrease the amount of earmarks and excessive spending by the national government. And then no more smoke and mirrors baseline budgeting, meaning that we require a balanced budget each year. It's very interesting because the state of Texas requires a balanced budget each year, but the national government doesn't, and that's why we can run those national deficits and then run up our national debt. So that would be a solution that's often proposed. However, I feel like with the number of backdoor deals and the smoke and mirrors involved in the federal government, it would be very tricky to try to get everyone in line. So no more smoke and mirrors may be a viable solution, but I think it would be very tricky to implement. That's just my personal opinion. All right, so there's a number of these solutions, and you're going to be asked in your discussion board question about which one you think could do the most good overall. All right. Revenue. Let's go ahead and talk about the revenue side of this, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the expenditure side here in just a little bit. The revenue side of fiscal policy. Well, we generate revenue, or the federal government generates revenue from a number of channels. First off is income taxes. It was just last week was April 15th, so if you didn't file your taxes, I hope you do it soon or that you got an extension. But income taxes are a very important part of generating revenue for the federal government. We take out a number of income taxes. All individuals, if you have a job, pay income taxes. Payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are just a little bit different than income taxes. They are the Social Security, the Medicare and Medicaid. Maybe you have FICA taken out as well. Those are the extra taxes that are not under the federal withholding under your paycheck, but under the, say, the Medicare, the Medicaid, Social Security. Payroll taxes are calculated just a bit different as well. They're calculated just a bit different than income taxes, as you'll see. The U.S. government also generates revenue from corporate taxes, and then also customs duties and other miscellaneous taxes. Please do note that I'm going to present you with a number of numbers today. All numbers are subject to change. All right, so federal taxes, federal revenue. Where did most of the federal revenue come from? Well, you can see here that the federal government got around 47% of its revenue from income taxes, which makes sense because everyone pays income tax. And then 34% came from payroll tax, which is different once again than income tax. 10%, only 10% came from corporate taxes, and then 9% came from excise, estate, or other taxes, such as those duties or excise taxes that I mentioned. So it's very interesting that 47% of the federal government's money comes from income tax, and only 10% comes from corporate tax. And because that's very interesting, because what you're going to see here in just a little bit is that corporations do have more money typically, but they don't necessarily pay more than taxes than the average American. So it's very interesting. If you did pay taxes in 2013, like I said, I wish I had the 2014 numbers, but I don't. If you paid taxes in 2013, this is where most of your dollars and cents went. 26.5%, so nearly a quarter of your federal tax dollar, or a little bit over a quarter of your federal tax dollar, went to the military. The military is by far the biggest expenditure for the United States. It's the one thing that we spend the most money on. Not only that, we spend more money on it than any other nation out there. So we spend a lot of money on military. A quarter of your tax dollar went to the military. 20 cents went to healthcare with the Obamacare mandate and things like that. So 20 cents went to healthcare. Interest on the federal debt, 13 cents of that went towards paying interest on our federal debt because the United States, like I said, is trying to decrease the deficit. So we're trying to pay back those interests on federal debt. And then 12.2% went to unemployment and labor, 5.4% went to just general government functions, 4 cents went to food and agricultural, 4 cents also went to veterans benefits, and 4 cents also went to housing and community projects. Only 3.5% went to education, 2.1% went to energy and environment, 1.4, only 1 cent went to international affairs, 1.4 to transportation, and only 1 cent to science. So it's very interesting. I think it's always interesting, particularly when I'm in person. I always relay this graph to students, and usually they react to the fact that only 3.5% and then only 1 cent went to science, whereas say 20 cents went to healthcare and 26 cents went to the military. So it's kind of very interesting to kind of start that debate about where the federal government's priorities are and things like that. But I'll leave that be since this isn't an in-person class. 3 kinds of taxation, and these are the things you need to know, because as a tax-paying citizen, or a future tax-paying citizen, if you will, it's good to know what kind of taxes are out there. 3 kinds of taxation. First off, you have the progressive tax. Progressive tax is the one that we're most familiar with because it's the one that income tax is. Because we're so familiar with income tax, we're very familiar with the idea of a progressive tax. A progressive tax simply states that higher income individuals pay a larger percentage of their income. So the more you make, the more you pay. If you're a high income individual, you're going to pay more than, say, a low income individual. A regressive tax, which we actually do have here in the United States, is very, very interesting as well, but we're not as aware of it because we're not as aware of the taxes that are associated with regressive taxes. Regressive tax says the higher income individuals pay a lower percentage of their income. So the more you make, the less you pay. If you're a higher income individual, you will pay less than, say, a low income individual who will pay more. And then finally, the flat tax is a very simple concept. It's just that everyone pays the same percentage. And there are a few examples of a flat tax here in the United States. You can think of sales tax. Sales tax is charged the same rate to everybody. It doesn't matter if you make $40,000 a year, you make $2,000 a year, or you make $500,000 a year. Anytime you buy a good, you're going to pay the same flat tax, the same flat rate sales tax. Sales tax is charged to everybody at the same rate regardless of your income. So that's the idea of a flat tax. I just wanted to kind of mention that real quick. But let's go ahead and talk about income taxes versus payroll taxes. Income taxes we're very familiar with. In general, when it comes to the tax code, there are 6 different tax brackets. And the tax rates increase as you reach higher tax brackets. And I don't have the exact numbers for each tax bracket. I wish I did. I should have put that in a graph in here real quick. So forgive me if I didn't. You can research them if you want to. You can just probably Google 6 tax brackets or whatever. But the tax rates increase as you reach higher tax brackets. So that's an example of a progressive tax. As you reach higher tax brackets, your tax rate will go up. The more you make, the more you pay. Income taxes are thus a progressive tax. The more you make, the more you pay. Each tax bracket that you reach, the higher tax rate you're going to pay. That makes sense. That's the one that we're all familiar with. We're all familiar that if you make more money, you're going to pay more in income taxes. Payroll taxes, however, are very, very different. Payroll taxes are usually, like I said, the Social Security, the Medicare, and the Medicaid taxes that are taken out on your weekly paycheck if you do have a job. How payroll taxes work. Payroll taxes, you pay 4.2% for Social Security, and you pay 1.45% for Medicare. So that's very simple, very easy to keep track of. You pay 4.2% of your income on Social Security, and you pay 1.45% for Medicare on your income. Your employer pays 6.2% for Social Security and 1.45% for Medicare. So if you're an employer, you're going to pay more for Social Security, but you're going to pay the same rate for Medicare. This is where payroll taxes are a little bit different, though. Payroll taxes are flat for the first $110,000, $110,100. So your payroll taxes are flat. If you make up to $110,100, you're going to pay this 4.2% or the 6.2%, depending on whether you're an employee or an employer. This is where it's different. But anything above this is not subject to payroll taxes. So as soon as you reach this $110,100, you no longer have to pay any more into Social Security or Medicare. Payroll taxes are thus regressive. The people that make less are going to pay a higher percentage than the people that make over $110,100. As soon as they reach that $110,100, they don't have to pay any more into it. So therefore, they're not being charged more taxes. So the more you make, the less you pay, and the less you make, the more you pay. Payroll taxes are thus regressive. And if you're self-employed, it depends on how much you make, but you are considered an employer if you're self-employed, so you'll pay this 6.2%. So I just wanted to add that real quick. So income taxes are progressive tax. Payroll taxes are a regressive tax. Poor people pay more into payroll taxes than those that are of higher income. They'll pay less into payroll taxes. Now, the individuals that make more money will pay more in income taxes, but they won't pay more in payroll taxes. And the people that make less money will pay less into income taxes, but they'll pay more into payroll taxes. So it may be a little bit confusing, but I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about the difference between income tax and payroll tax, and how income tax is progressive and how payroll taxes are regressive, be sure to send those questions my way. But I just wanted to introduce you to the idea of taxes, because guess what? You'll probably be paying them for the rest of your life. Corporate taxes. Corporate taxes, well, none of us probably own a corporation, so we don't have to really deal with it too much, but it's very interesting to talk about, because it's a highly debated topic into how much corporations should pay. The fact is that corporate tax rates for the federal government are around 15% to 35%. This 35% is the highest in the world. States can also take up to 0% to 10% depending on the state. And some cities will charge corporate taxes up to 9%. So you say, wow, they're paying 35%. That's huge. That's the highest in the world. And not only that, they're paying double tax. They're paying corporate taxes plus their income tax. And you would think that corporations are being taxed a lot, that they're going to have to pay a lot into the federal government. But the fact is that the corporate tax rate actually really isn't that high, and that's what it is on paper, but there are so many loopholes and write-offs for corporations that some will pay zero. You have corporations such as GE and then also the Bank of America that will actually pay 0% in taxes overall. The reason why is that there's a number of loopholes, and also there's a number of subsidies and write-offs that corporations can take advantage of. In addition to that, there's also tax havens. You can think of the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Switzerland, where these corporations will take their profit money, put it into a bank offshore, and then that way when the federal government or tax season comes around, they won't be able to take that money and then tax it. So that's how a lot of corporations will get away with paying a 0% tax rate. And in no way am I saying all corporations do this, but there are a high number of corporations that do this and try to avoid that 35% rate. So the fact that 35% is the highest in the world may beg the question, should the United States lower its tax rates so that the incentives to move those assets offshores isn't there? Or should the federal government be more strict and try to close the loopholes so that the corporations actually do have to pay their taxes? And that's why, going back to that pie chart that I showed you earlier, and the fact is that 47% of the government's money is raised from income taxes and only 10% is raised from corporate taxes. Even though if all corporations did actually pay this 35%, you would easily see the government revenue increase. But corporations are pretty smart for taking advantage of these loopholes and write-offs so that they don't have to pay taxes. So it's a high debate. If you're on the left side and the right side, or whatever political ideology you may be, you may have your own justifications. I just wanted to make you aware of the fact that this is happening, and this is the tax rate, even though it may not actually be the true amount of taxes that corporations pay. All right. Other taxes from the government, you have capital gains tax, and these are just taxes on stocks, bonds, and real estates, estate, precious metals, anything like that. If you own stock, if you're invested in the market overall, they'll take a capital gains tax out. You also have excise taxes. Excise taxes are just taxes on luxuries such as gas, alcohol, tobacco, certain vices, things like that. Those are all excise taxes. Customs and duties, those are all taxes on imports. If you take something from, say you buy something in Germany or something like that, and you import it here into America, you have to pay a customs tax. And then inheritance taxes. If your family is lucky enough to be wealthy enough, you may have to pay an inheritance tax, but those are usually only on families that make more than $5.3 million. So not a lot of us will probably be paying inheritance taxes, but it is a way that the government does take certain money. All right. Measuring wealth. Well, we need to talk about wealth because wealth has a lot to do with the taxes that you pay and how you're doing overall in your standard of living. We equate wealth with net worth, the sum total of your assets minus your liabilities. So it's the number of assets you have minus your liabilities. Basically, the amount of profit or valuable things that you have minus the debts that you have, if you will. So examples of assets include your checkings and savings account. That's typically what we're most familiar with. That's the money that we actually have. Vehicles, a home that you own, mutual funds, stocks and bonds, real estate, and retirement accounts. All the wealth that you've acquired, or all the profitable things, I guess, you've acquired, minus your debts. Examples of liabilities would be a car loan. That would be a debt. Your credit card balance, your student loan, your personal loan, your mortgage, and other bills you still need to pay. Those are all debts. So your wealth is your number of assets minus your liability. And here in the United States, it's very interesting because we have a huge problem with wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is even more pronounced than income inequality. Wealth inequality basically means that the top 1% of income earners have a lot more wealth or have accrued a lot more wealth than, say, the bottom 20% or even the bottom 50% have accrued. Because there's so much wealth accumulated at the top that there's very little left for those at the bottom. And that's the idea of wealth inequality, and it's a huge problem here in America. And I've included on this next slide a link, and I really want you to watch this video on wealth inequality in America. And it's really kind of telling about how bad wealth inequality is here in America, and it kind of questions whether we should do something about it, whether it's a major concern, and whether the economy can sustain this level of wealth inequality that we have here in America. So I've included the link here. If you want to go ahead and click on it on your own slides, I'll also put it under the Lessons tab so that you can find it there. But at this time, go ahead and pause my video and watch this wealth inequality in America video, if you will. I'll give you a second just to pause the video. Alright, so hopefully you watched that video. Hopefully you may have learned some things, or maybe kind of had an eye-opening experience, if you will. If not, that's completely fine as well. I just wanted to present the facts to you in a way that was way better than what I could have done it. So here's 2009. This is where we were at with 2009. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of figures that I could find that are more updated. But here's the distribution of wealth in the U.S. here in the United States. Here you have the top 1%, here you have the top 5%, and then here you have the top 20%. The top 20% takes up quite a sizable chunk of this chart here. The bottom 80%, the average Americans, the bottom 80%, only have 12.8% of the total wealth in the United States. The top 20% have well over, let's see if I can do the math here in real time, have well over 80% of the wealth, more or less, 88%. 87%, sorry, trying to do the math on the fly here. They have about 87% of the total wealth here in the United States. The bottom 80%, the average Americans, most middle-class Americans, only have 12.8% of the wealth here in the United States. So much wealth has been accumulated over here in the top 20%. In the U.S. stock market, it's even worse. Top 1% own 38% of the stock market. The top 5% own a combined nearly 80% of the stock market. And then the top 20% have around 98% of the stock market. So the average American, the middle-class American, isn't investing in the stock market because they simply can't afford to. They can't afford to invest in the stock market, and therefore they're not growing their own incomes. But because the top 80% own nearly 98% of the market, then they're the ones that are investing, and therefore they're making more profit, and that's why the wealth inequality has really, really gone up. Income inequality, aside from wealth inequality, is also a big problem. The average household income over here on the left, the red here is the top 1%. You can see that their average household income has increased since 1979, nearly tripled, from 0.5 million to half a million to nearly 2 million. So it's almost quadrupled, if you will. Whereas the rest of the 99%, if you will, their incomes have roughly stayed the same. They're not making a whole lot of money more, but the top 1% is making so much more. And the part of that is because of the fact that the top 1% is so heavily invested in the stock market. They own a lot of the major corporations. They own a lot of the banks and things like that. And that's why the top 1%, their wealth has increased so much. Change in the share of income, as you can see, the share of income from 1979 for the top 1%, their income has increased nearly 130%. Whereas other average American citizens, the top 99%, or basically the bottom 80%, their incomes have decreased. So while the incomes of the top 1% is increasing every year and increasing nearly 130% in 30 years, but the average American or the bottom 80% their incomes are decreasing, that's a huge concern for income inequality. If income inequality keeps expanding like this, the bottom 80% isn't going to have any more money to spend, and all the money will be accrued in the top 1%. So this could be a huge concern for the overall economy. In 2012, these are 2012 numbers, this is just a little bit different. The red is the top 5% rather than the top 1%, but even then you can see the top 1%, their average household income has increased dramatically since the 1970s. The bottom, the second 20%, the third 20%, the fourth 20%, and then the bottom 20%, their incomes have stayed stagnant. They haven't risen. They're not making more money. Therefore, they're not spending more money, and that could also be a huge concern for the economy overall. There's a number of good documentaries on the income inequality problem in America on Netflix. I would definitely encourage you guys to watch some of them, and maybe you can kind of get a sense of the economic system overall if you do watch those. But that's up to you. I just wanted to put that in there. All right. So what do we do about it? Can we raise the tax rate? Can we handle this some other way, like the other viable options that I mentioned earlier? Well, the fact is that we don't want to raise the tax rates too much because we have to deal with this economic concept of the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve says that setting the tax rates too high will reduce the amount of taxes collected. But if we raise them to just the right amount, to the equilibrium point, then we'll be better off. And here it is. This is the reason why. Setting the tax rates too high will reduce the amount of taxes collected. So let's say we set the rate at 100%. Well, you'd have zero revenue. And the reason why is because if the tax rate is 100%, then you've collected all the money that it's out there, and you can't ever collect more money. As soon as you have all the money, consumers will have no money to spend money and to raise taxes off of. You won't have people having incomes, you won't have people having spending power or anything like that. So that would be extreme. If your tax rate was 100%, everything went right to the government, then you would have zero tax revenue to be collected because the money just simply isn't out there. What you want to try for is a medium tax rate. A medium tax rate that will allow you consumers to spend, but also allow you to collect taxes off of that spent money or off of that revenue. And so that's why you want to look for this equilibrium point. And that's the idea of the Laffer curve. If you don't tax at all, obviously you're not going to have revenue because you're not taxing at all. If you tax way too much, you're not going to have any revenue because there's no money out there. You want to look for an equilibrium point, a happy medium between taxing and then allowing your consumers to spend money. The United States currently rests on the left side of this equilibrium point. Currently, we're around point A. Our tax rates, like I said, are around 15 to 30%, depending on how much you make. And so that's why right now we're at point A. So theoretically, we could actually increase the tax rate to try to find this equilibrium point. There's just a lot of concern about what could actually happen if we do. And so that totally makes sense. So whether you're on the left side or the right side, liberal, conservative, libertarian, populist, whatever you may be on, tax curve or the tax rate is a very highly debated topic, and it's very good to be aware of this Laffer curve. That way you don't tax too much or you don't tax too little, and it's all about trying to find this equilibrium point. And also remember, back to fiscal policy, who gets to pay for all of this stuff as well. So that's a huge debate, but I at least wanted to present this idea to you for today's lecture. Where do we go for the future? Taxation in the future. Well, there are actually a number of alternatives that have been proposed and that are out there. Instead of this progressive, regressive income tax, payroll tax, entitlements, things like that, what about trying to reform the system overall? One idea here is the flat tax. Remember, like I said, sales tax is a flat tax. Everyone pays the same rate. Well, the same thing could be applied to income tax. What if everyone paid the same rate on income tax? Most flat tax ideas is that you would have a $26,000 exemption. So if you make less than $26,000, you'll pay no taxes because that's generally considered below the poverty line. But as soon as you make $26,000 or more, then you would be taxed, anything above that is taxed at 17%. You would also have a $5,000 exemption for each child. So if you had each child, they would say that, oh, well, you'll get a tax exemption up to $5,000. So for each child, you could have an additional $5,000 off. But for anything over your exemptions, or over your exemption rate, you would be taxed at 17%. So anything above that is taxed at 17%. All of your income is taxed at 70%, so that would be the idea of a flat tax. A fair tax. A fair tax would be a national sales tax, basically. It would be an example of a flat tax, but it would be considered a fair tax because you only pay for what you need. You would take 23% on purchase of all goods and services. So this could be a good idea because you only pay for what you need. If you don't want to pay taxes, then just don't buy as many goods, basically. And then you also have what's called a family consumption allowance, which say you have a family that you need to support, maybe you would have an allowance that would allow you to purchase certain goods for items that you needed. And then finally, VAT taxes. I've included a link here on a video that kind of explains VAT taxes. But VAT taxes stands for value-added taxes. And it's basically, a lot of countries in Europe use this system. Taxes are added for each step of production needed. So for more sophisticated items that need more production or need more steps in production, those items tend to be more expensive. There tends to be more tax added on them. But say you just needed a really simple cell phone, then you wouldn't pay a large amount of tax on that. But say you needed a really fancy iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or whatever, then those more sophisticated items, because they take more production steps, would be more expensive, and you would pay more on taxes for luxuries, basically. The exact rate is undecided and it's often unclear, but each government kind of sets its own value-added tax rate. And so the United States would have to kind of decide that if they were to go through this route. But the VAT taxes are an interesting way to kind of approach it. Usually low-income individuals won't need as many sophisticated items, so they won't pay as many taxes. But if you want those luxury items, then you could pay more taxes, and especially if you can afford to pay for those luxury items, you would pay more taxes that way. So those are all just kind of three alternative proposals. There's the flat tax, the fair tax, the value-added tax. If you want to explore more of these, I would definitely encourage some research on them. They're definitely viable solutions for the future, but just trying to implement them and trying to reform the tax code would be very, very difficult. So that's up to you. If you want to research them more, I would definitely encourage it. I think it's a very interesting debate. So, all right, so we talked enough about taxes, and what about expenditures? What is the government spending its money on within foreign policy? Expenditures, one of the biggest expenditures is Social Security. Social Security was established during the Great Depression. The average check for Social Security is only $1,200. And it used to be that you had to be 65 to collect Social Security, now 67. And the idea for Social Security would be that enough people would have saved enough money during their working years and had a nice trust fund or a nice retirement plan to take care of them when they got older. But what we're seeing now is that actually more senior citizens are relying solely on that Social Security check. And because the average check is only $1,200, it's not enough to cover all the costs and things that they need. So the fact that Social Security, so many people are tapping into Social Security, means that there's less Social Security funds, and the fact that they don't have suitable retirement plans or they haven't saved enough money during their working years, that kind of calls into question the future of Social Security. And that's why there's this 2018 prediction, whether Social Security can last that long or not. And if this was an in-person class, I'd actually have you debate that. But there is this 2018 prediction that Social Security will be completely gone by that time. Medicare, the government spends a lot of money on Medicare. This is just health insurance for retired people and disabled. And then the government also spends money on Medicaid as well. Most enrollees are women and children, but most of the money goes to the elderly and disabled. So elderly and disabled tend to take advantage of Medicaid as well, even though a lot of women and children are enrolled in it, but it's good to have for those low-income women and children. Who uses social spending programs? Well, the fact is that the elderly do. The elderly use the far majority of these social spending programs. Followed, not nearly as close, but followed by low-income Americans. They account for a certain amount of social spending programs, around 29%. But you can see the clear majority, around 55%, are elderly. They're the ones that use the social spending programs the most. Veterans and active duty, they take around 8% of the social spending programs. And unemployed people only take 5%, and 3% comes from other sources as well. So, like I said, the elderly use the most of these social spending programs, and then low-income Americans, low-income adults. So, More expenditures. The government also spends money on income security, interest payments on the national debt. We try to spend a certain amount of money for the national debt, 7% of the annual budget. And then finally, defense. Defense is consistently around 20% of the U.S. annual expenditures, roughly $708 billion. So defense is by far the highest thing that we spend the most money on. It's roughly $708 billion. And it's also very interesting that more than 47% of the total global spending on defense comes from the United States. The United States spends around 47% of all countries' spending on defense. So 47% of all the globe's spending on national defense. I don't feel like I'm explaining that well enough, but hopefully that makes sense. They spend 47% of the entire world's spending on defense. It comes from the U.S. So that's a huge chunk. The U.S. alone spends 47% of the globe's spending on defense. That means we have a huge military and a huge defense system. So we're going to get a little bit more into that when we talk about foreign policy next week, but I just at least wanted to throw that idea out there right now because it is part of the expenditures for fiscal policy that we need to discuss. So those are all the expenditures of the United States government. There's a number of other things that we spend money on, but to put out the whole list on just this one slideshow or this one lecture would take way too long. So just wanted to give you some general ideas of where the government spends its money. Let's move on to your discussion board questions. You've made it through the lecture. Hopefully now you know about trade policy, you know about monetary policy, you know about fiscal policy. But once again, as always, if you have any questions, please ask. That way you guys are prepared for the test. All right, so discussion board question number 1. In addition to the information in this lecture, I want you to Google free trade debate and weigh in. You can go to the Wikipedia page, you can go to a number of websites that are listed below that one as well. I want you to answer the question. I want a good, reasoned response. Is free trade good or bad for the domestic economy? How about for the global economy? Is free trade inevitable? Has the trend of globalization already set in, or can we break the chain of globalization? Would we even want to, though? I want you to give your opinion, and I will give extra credit points for well thought out and reasoned responses. So if you give me a great response, you weigh in on the trade debate, you tell me the pros and cons, and you can convince me that your idea of free trade is good or your idea of free trade is bad, if you can convince me about that, then I will be sure to give you some extra credit points for sure. I want you to give your thoughts on the income and then finally, moving on. Second of all, for your discussion board questions, I want you to give your thoughts on the income inequality video that you watched. Hopefully you paused my video and watched that income inequality video. Is income inequality a problem for the United States? Consider some viable solutions. Should the top 1% pay more, or are there other solutions to the problem? Consider corporate tax rates, consider the tax havens I talked about, consider the personal tax brackets, and other fiscal policy concepts in your answer. Be sure to answer that one with a well-reasoned and thought-out response as well, and I will probably give you extra credit if you convince me that there is a viable solution and that your viable solution that you chose is absolutely the best way for the United States to go. So those are your discussion board questions. If you have any questions about those, send those my way. We covered a lot of things today, I know. So we covered trade policy, we covered fiscal policy, we covered monetary policy, we covered public policy in general as well. So if you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to ask. There will be a number of questions on your test about the stuff that we covered in lecture today, so be sure to hit me up with those questions. Other than that, next week we will talk about foreign policy, and then your research paper is due, and then you'll have your final exam. So the light is there at the end of the tunnel. I encourage you guys to keep up the good work, and I will see you next week.